which means that we're going to be waiting on people. I just saw that the Hangout on air is live. All right, so here tonight, going to talk over some A-Push, look at some financial history and that sort of thing. I'm here with Keith Neal, who's an A-Push teacher from North Carolina. Keith, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, I teach in Lincoln County, North Carolina, and I appreciate Tom having me on tonight. I teach A-Push as well as AP Euro, and just glad to be here to bat around some ideas.
All right, and we are just at this point waiting on people to show up, usually a few minutes on that. And we're going to do that. We'll shave the first few minutes off whenever we get this thing archived and all of that kind of stuff. So we're just gonna sit here for a few minutes, and right now we've got 0 viewers, and we're going to see if that number increases. Hopefully it will. Now, keep in mind that there is going to be some live chat in the actual Hangout, and I'm not really going to be monitoring that a whole lot. What I'm going to be monitoring is I'll be looking on Twitter here and there, looking for things that y'all are asking. So keep in mind that if you want to ask questions, Twitter is going to be the best place to do that. I may even check Instagram once or twice, but Twitter is usually the best way for me to keep up with questions. And let's see, so we've got that. All right. And still waiting for an audience. In a few minutes, we'll go ahead and get started.
How many typically do you have in one of these things?
It really depends. I've had, typically, I think now it can get a lot when you get up to the exam, but I've had, I think when I did an AP Euro one, we averaged around 35 to 40 viewers at a time. People kind of come and go. We've got a few viewers, so this is good, and looks like we've got 2. So yeah, who knows how many will show up at any given time. Now we're up to 3. Okay, this is the part where people start trickling in. So I think we are about ready to get started. I'm going to go ahead and maybe wait just about another minute, see who shows up. Feel free to introduce yourself in the comments or to tweet at me, at Tom Richey. It's very easy to find me on Twitter, so consider that as well. That's another option for you. So either to comment, or if you want to talk to each other, also to tweet. We've got a few likes. Okay, excellent. Glad some people are liking this already. Keep in mind that we are going to be talking about the Federal Reserve and the role of central banking in U.S. history. All right. Well, Keith, I see that we've got an audience of 5 right now at least. We've got some people that have shown up. Others are going to be coming in here. So when I give the signal, I always kind of get to the point where I'm going to cut the Hangout off, as far as when I archive it. So I'm just going to begin in a second as if we've just started for the first time.
Okay.
All right. Hey there, students. We're doing a live Hangout for AP US History, and I've done some AP US History videos. I know I focus more on Euro, but I also teach US, do some videos for that once in a while, and I'll be doing some live Hangouts coming up to the exam. I am here with Keith Neal, who is an A-Push teacher from North Carolina. Keith, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, I teach at a place called West Lincoln High School in Lincoln County, North Carolina, and I appreciate you having me on, Tom, tonight to talk about progressivism and central banking and really, I guess, the whole history of the idea of how the currency is created, how it is used politically, and all the related issues to the Fed and central banking.
All right, well, thank you. And this all started off actually as a Facebook discussion in an AP US History teachers group, and it seemed to me that Keith had done a lot of reading on the Federal Reserve, and there's actually, this is something that you're going to probably see come up in the news. Right now, a lot of stuff's focused on the Iran stuff and that sort of thing, but there's a lot going on about the Fed, and as the Federal Reserve is called, that's right now that I think that, given that it's a current issue, and that it's something that has a lot of power. It's an institution that has a lot of power when it comes to our economy, and it would benefit us to know a little bit more about it, to know a little bit more about its origins, and then also to discuss why it is that Americans tend to distrust this institution. So let me go ahead and start you off. I'm going to share my screen with you real quick, And hopefully you're following politics enough to know about Senator Rand Paul, who is the son of Congressman Ron Paul. And Senator Rand Paul has reintroduced a bill to, quote unquote, audit the Fed. Now, this article says that Rand Paul, potential 2016 presidential candidate, on Wednesday reintroduced a bill that would expose the Federal Reserve's monetary policy discussions and decisions to a congressional audit. All right, and this has 30 co-sponsors in the Senate, so meaning that 30 out of 100 senators are already behind this before it is even out of the gate. And that's the thing. It says here that the Fed gained broad regulatory powers and implemented massive stimulus measures after the 2007-2009 financial crisis, expanding its balance sheet to $4.5 trillion. Okay, now, Keith, this seems pretty reasonable to me. Now, I'm going to go ahead and let our student audience know that I'm going to come at this. I believe that debate is kind of it's a good teaching tool. And so in tonight's discussion, I'm going to be offering a more skeptical perspective, and which is kind of something I'm more comfortable with anyway. And Keith's going to be answering some questions that I put to him, perhaps offering some things on his own, perhaps even answering, asking me some questions. Now, when I think about this, that the Federal Reserve, this is a body that controls about $4.5 trillion. They make decisions about our monetary policy. What's wrong with, why shouldn't this be audited, Keith? Why shouldn't we want to keep an eye on the Federal Reserve, a very close eye?
Well, this whole audit the Fed movement obviously goes back to Rand Paul's father, Ron, who is a guy who kind of caught fire because he was skeptical, just like you are, of the role of the Federal Reserve and of the kind of almost, I won't say nefarious, but certainly hidden role that this Federal Reserve seems to have. People don't understand how it works. They don't understand who's running it. And I guess on the surface, if somebody says, let's audit this institution that people don't know a lot about, it sounds like a great idea. It sounds like you're doing what Congress should do, which is exercise oversight. But if you dig a little bit, then you find out that the Federal Reserve is in fact audited on a very regular basis. They report in excruciating detail everything that they purchase, everything that they own, all of their expenditures. I mean, there's probably no other bank in the world, at least no other central bank, that is as transparent as these guys. So when you say you want to introduce a bill to audit the Fed, in other words, you're going to use the force of law to somehow force this institution to open its books, then you're certainly begging a question. You're leaving something out there. You're saying, hey, this institution is, or you're at least allowing people to believe, this institution is out of control, there's no oversight, it's completely independent, and it has all this power to affect the lives of millions of people. At least that's my view of this whole push to audit the Fed. I don't really think it's actually about auditing the Fed. I think it's more of a political thing. But, you may differ.
Now, the thing is, I guess you said that we can see the Federal Reserve, like what they do. Okay, by the way, we purchased treasury bonds or whatever they did, or we lowered or raised interest rates. But from what I can see in this article, it looks like the American people, neither the American people nor the Congress has access to the discussions, that they get to have private discussions, so that we don't really know the motivations behind the decisions that they make. We know these decisions are being made, but what about the motivations behind them?
This is absolutely true. And the Fed does operate under this veil of secrecy. Now, they make the discussions available after a period of time, but for the purposes of keeping an independent body in charge of the money supply, you don't necessarily want these discussions to be public all the time. Can they be looked at a later date? Absolutely. But do you want Congress directly meddling in monetary supply? Probably not a good idea. Do you want the president meddling directly in Fed policy? Probably not a good idea, simply because the politics of the time could potentially lead you to set some pretty bad monetary policy or interest rate policy.
Now, but does that mean that the Federal Reserve is going to always set good monetary policy?
No, it's not perfect. It's run by human beings. It's not a mechanized or computerized outfit. And have they made mistakes in the past? Well, yeah. absolutely. But, and this touches directly on our discussion earlier when you and I discussed the progressives. The progressives believe strongly that government, business, society in general should depend on experts, expert management. I teach this as fostering efficiency, that whole Taylorism thing, but it also comes under expert management. You want to hire people who know what they're talking about and who probably have the best chance to do a really good job at something like managing something as monstrously huge as the money supply.
But then, I guess, yeah, I mean, you're getting into the progressive reliance on experts. Now, the other thing about the progressives is their belief in a more centralized state, our centralized federal apparatus, that the federal government should be taking on more responsibilities, and also the idea that government is not necessarily to be feared, like, the Jeffersonian tradition, but government is something that can actually do good things for us. And I wonder if that's, you think about the Federal Reserve, okay, well, let's let these experts manage it. Well, can these experts manage the economy better than the market? Because it seems to me that the progressives, to some extent at least, have a problem with the unregulated free market, that they don't believe in that as the best way to go. I mean, why can't the market set interest rates? And why can't we base our money supply on something like gold, or something that is tangible rather than something that's just going to keep changing every time the Federal Reserve decides, okay, let's raise and lower it at our whims?
The Federal Reserve in this case, and I'll speak to your larger point here in just a second, but I think the progressives would argue that the Federal Reserve is simply setting the stage for the market to function. They create money out of thin air, fiat money, and they can influence the supply of that money. They can either take money out of the economy or put it into fairly rapidly. And by doing that, they allow banks to set interest rates. Example, if you go to your particular bank, you may get a different mortgage rate than I get at mine. So there are market forces at work. Is it a pure, laissez-faire, interference-free market? Well, absolutely not. And you're absolutely correct that the progressives believe that it was the role of government to use its power to make life better for everybody, but especially, and of course we get into a political angle here, but especially for the people that they thought were underrepresented. In fact, I think they would probably argue that government was a check on the power of big business. And in the days when the progressives are really, really coming to feel that they have a chance to influence things by taking over the government through an election, you have some really, really big business that we like to call monopolies and trust. Standard Oil, good example, Carnegie Steel. And I think that they would say that they're using the power of government to give the little guy a chance, to foster competition, to break up trusts that are anti-competitive and indeed destroy markets.
Well, Keith, what I'm wondering here is, we hear about Rockefeller and Carnegie and all of these so-called monopolists from the late 19th century, which Rockefeller, it's like kind of put that together himself. And the price of oil went down, the quality of oil went up, the government didn't really do him any favors, and of course people resent the guy because he put something together. But at the same time, have we not taken those monopolists and replaced it with a government monopoly? I mean, it seems like today, I mean, we hear about J.P. Morgan at the turn of the 20th century bailing the government out. And I'm thinking about the size of government today relative to our richest entrepreneurs. You think about Bill Gates. If he were to give all of his money to the government today, I don't know if it would make a dent in our deficit. And isn't that what we should be afraid of?
Well, I don't see it that way. I mean, you just said a whole big mouthful. How big does a monopoly have to be for you to call it a bad thing? And you made the argument, that was really interesting, you made the same argument that Rockefeller made at his antitrust hearings, that here I am, all I've done is create a good product at a reasonable price for the American public, and you're making me a criminal.
Did he not?
He did indeed. But at what point do we say that Rockefeller has too much power? I mean, if we're gonna say that the federal government, who exercises its power in the interest, at least theoretically, I know you disagree with me, of all people, is that better than a guy like Rockefeller who exercises power in the interest of one person, namely Rockefeller? And I know his ideology would say something along the lines of what Carnegie said. You know, it's a sin to die rich. In other words, I'm gonna use my wealth for the greater good of mankind, and I'm better positioned to do it than any third party, government, charity, etc. But I would argue that once you get huge monopolies that are in control of industries and can set price at their whim, that they're much more dangerous than a government that at least can be changed by a vote of the people.
Well, I mean, that's theoretically. Now, of course, the progressives also had that faith in a government that is democratically controlled is going to be, yeah, that is going to be under the control of the people. But then again, I just wonder to what extent, even though we all vote, is our government really that responsive to us today? Now, I'm seeing in the chat some people are talking about the nature of the Fed. That the Fed is, people are like, is this a public bank? Is it a private bank? It's kind of not a girl, not yet a woman sort of thing. And let's address that, Keith. I'm seeing a lot of that talk in the comments. So if you wouldn't mind, I know you've done a little more reading on this lately than me. What exactly is the Federal Reserve?
It's a really odd combination of public-private venture. It's really unique among central banks in that private companies own stock in it, but the federal government has chartered the thing. I mean, so it doesn't fit neatly into any kind of categorization. It has a legislative role that it's mandated to play. In fact, it has several. But it doesn't operate completely independently. No matter how it's set up and no matter how they try to proclaim their independence, they still have a little bit of political pressure simply because they're mandated to do things like operate in such a way as to guarantee as close to possible full employment. That mandate comes down in the 70s. And they are also responsible for inspecting banks. And you could see how that could be politicized very easily. In fact, in 2008, with the last big meltdown we had, I mean, the Fed did some things that were pretty heavy-handed, and some might say completely unconstitutional, because they were forcing banks, private corporations, to do things against their will. So, it is sometimes an exercise in raw power. But, the Fed is supposed to operate independently of that political power. And, of course, that ties back in. I don't want to get too far afield here, but that ties back in to the original purpose of central banking, going all the way back to the Hamilton-Jefferson debate.
Well, now, of course, that's where, if we go all the way back to Hamilton-Jefferson, and I think you mentioned before, unconstitutional. I mean, I look at my Constitution, and I don't see anything about central banking. I don't see anything about the Federal Reserve. Does the government really have the power to charter a central bank that's going to independently control our monetary policy, our money supply, our interest rates, and all of that kind of stuff, really without the direct consent of the people?
Well, Hamilton's argument obviously was that it did, that Congress is sovereign, and within the elastic clause, Congress can do what is necessary to do things like coin and money. And if the central bank helps in the establishment of a stable currency, that would be Hamilton's interpretation, that a central bank, the Bank of the U.S. in this case, was helping to establish a stable currency. And you also got to remember that Hamilton, if anything, was scared to death of what he saw immediately following the Revolution, a Congress that was involved in monetizing their debt. They just printed massive amounts of money, and he thought that this way, and the Bank of the U.S., by the way, was 75% privately owned, it was either 20 or 25% owned by the government. I can't remember the exact percentages, but it was mostly in private hands, and he thought that would be a check on the tendency of government to monetize the debt and to create massive inflation, hyperinflation, and to destroy the worth of the currency and people's confidence in the overall economy.
All right. Well, that's it. Now, but the thing is, you talk about 25% government owned, 75% private owned, and of course that's the Bank of the United States. Now, the Federal Reserve, I think about Andrew Jackson's veto of the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, which to me is one of the most important documents in U.S. history, where he talks about the federal government chartering an institution that's really serving to make the rich richer at the expense of the common taxpayer, and that a lot of this stock is owned by even people from foreign countries.
Yes.
And that everybody pays taxes, that Americans, that any kind of institution that is set up to enrich people at the with the government's help at the expense of others, is the Federal Reserve not doing the same thing?
How is the Federal Reserve enriching wealthy people at the expense of taxpayers? If it's creating fiat money, and in actuality, if you look at the books of the Fed, they returned $85 billion to the Treasury in profit last year. So their activities yield money for the Treasury. They're not taking any tax money. I mean,
Okay, so now the thing is, I guess what needs to be clarified is there are really no like private owners of the Fed, right? I mean, are there shareholders, anything like that, like you had with the First and Second Bank of the U.S.?
no, not in the same way. It's not a corporation in that way. Every bank in the United States has a relationship with the Fed. And I was looking at this last night. It's really odd. I was wondering how in the heck do they do this thing where they increase the money supply? It's all electronic, obviously, but every bank in the United States has an account with the Fed, and if you want to push money out there, you just type some numbers in a spreadsheet, and all of a sudden, boom, you have money. Fiat money is a very, very strange thing to try to get high school students to understand. Heck, I don't even understand it half the time myself. But the Fed is not that kind of corporation. It's not for profit. It's in private hands in the sense that you have individuals who are independent of the government who meet as boards of governors, and of course the most important is the New York Federal Reserve, and set monetary policy for the country, supposedly, and we know it's not completely true, independent of political pressure.
Now, is the Fed truly independent of political pressure?
Well, no. I mean, I think there have been cases, obviously, in the past where Nixon, for example, was able to influence, I forget the guy's name, who was the chairman then, to manipulate interest rates in order to try to help Nixon out in the election. I mean, this is a blatant abuse. That's why you need a strong personality in there, and that's why you do need some oversight. But Congress does have oversight authority over the Fed, which brings us back again to our audit proposal. I mean, what exactly does that audit proposal mean? The thing is being audited up one side and down the other. It's probably the most transparent bank in existence. And I don't know what further could be accomplished other than having Congress meddle in the quarterly meetings of the Fed and try to influence monetary policy in a very direct way.
And what would be necessarily bad about that, about our elected leaders trying? Because I mean, don't our elected leaders benefit if the economy is good?
They do, but they also benefit at the next election if the economy is good in the short term, at long term, at the expense of the long term. So there's good and bad, obviously, but we have experience, direct experience, with Congress being directly involved in the money supply. And after the Revolution, what happened? When the United States was in such tremendous debt, it looked like it was never going to be paid off. All you do is crank up the printing presses, print continental dollars until you run out of paper, and boom, you got hyperinflation, right? Nobody will accept the currency. That's not a very sound way to run an economy. And I think Hamilton feared that more than anything. He feared the political pressures that would lead to that kind of decision. And it's not just the United States. I mean, we can look around the world. That's been the solution in places like Argentina in very recent times, and the most egregious example probably Germany in the 1920s, where they just printed money until they could print no more, and it did collapse their economy. I don't think you want to have a meltdown every time somebody in Congress wants to boost their political popularity.
Now, speaking of the 1920s, now, of course, the Germans were printing all kinds of money. At the same time, throughout the 1920s, the Federal Reserve had interest rates very low, which, of course, that encouraged a lot of borrowing. Now, people don't like to point their fingers at the Federal Reserve about anything and say, oh, it's your fault, especially, historians who tend to love government and that sort of thing. But when it comes down to it, if people say that, well, overconsumption and overborrowing by consumers was a causal element of the Great Depression, and the Federal Reserve, by keeping interest rates artificially low, is encouraging this borrowing, and then all of a sudden the Federal Reserve realizes what's going on. They're like, oh, we've got to get those interest rates way up. And, whereas I ask myself, I've got a bit of a Jeffersonian faith in the market. Could the market not have handled this better than the Federal Reserve did? Like, hey, buy, spend, borrow, and then taps off. And then we've got the Depression. Now, I'm not saying, Keith, that that's the only thing leading to the Depression, but is this institution created by these progressives that's going to be centralized, that's going to manage our economy, that's going to be governed by experts? It seems to me like they did something to encourage something that put us into depression. Now, not to mention that we're in the middle of an economic downturn right now. Where's the Fed now?
The Fed, in my opinion, has done a magnificent job in this last downturn. Let's deal with the 1920s first. I think you're right. The Fed did some things wrong. I mean, obviously, easy credit, overconsumption, overproduction, all fed into the cause of the Great Depression. But there are so many other causes that I don't think you can hang the total cause of it on the Fed, which you did say. Now, when we talk about the 2008-2009 meltdown, there were a lot of other factors at work, not the least of which was the Congress meddling through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in mortgage interest rates, and not only encouraging people who probably couldn't afford houses to buy houses, but mandating that Fannie and Freddie seek out those people who would be first-time buyers and give them basically loans with not much of a background check. This whole thing about, oh, you have a job, congratulations, you have a loan, right? Terrible credit scores, and this led to this huge bubble in housing. So can you hang that at the door of the Fed? No, probably not. I think that's more a function of how the Congress structured Fannie and Freddie, right? But I don't know if I answered your question, but that's essentially my take on it. The Fed is not perfect.
Yeah, I think that you're there. I mean, when it comes down to it, you just kind of take a risk, because certainly more often than not, logic kind of tells you if we get some experts to kind of run our economy, then that's going to be better than just random. But then at the same time, the whole idea of laissez-faire, you've got the idea of the invisible hand, that government really backs off, and it seems like the Fed is like, woo, hands are visible. Now, I want to call attention to something that Jody said in the chat room. Hey, Jody. And Jody has said that really the Fed is just causing inflation. And there are a lot of times when I'm having to explain to my students, when you think about the campaigns in the 1890s, McKinley versus Bryan, and how McKinley was campaigning on the gold standard. He was campaigning for sound money, and they passed out these dollars or dimes. This is worth $1 if you vote for McKinley, and if you vote for Bryan, it's going to be worth a dime. And in Bryan, we trust for the other 47 cents or however much. And the thing is, you have this idea of sound currency, and it's the government's job to promote sound currency. And that goes all the way back to Jackson, who was a big hard money advocate. And of course, there are people going all the way to Ron Paul, and maybe to a lesser extent his son Rand. But when I think about this, I have to explain to my students, for example, when William Randolph Hearst was offering a $50,000 reward for any information dealing with the USS Maine. Now, of course, he knew there was none, but it's the whole Dr. Evil effect. $1 million. Wish I brought my Mr. Bigglesworth here or whatever. But the thing is that, you look at the whole Dr. Evil effect, that, oh, you know what, $1 million means nothing now. And we look back at the last century, and our currency has inflated 20 times. I told people, John D. Rockefeller, he'd go and he'd give dimes to little kids when he was retired. And I said, that's not some creepy old man coming up to you giving you a dime. That's some creepy old man coming to you and giving you $2. Now, to a little kid, you can buy some pretty serious candy with that. Get yourself a sugar rush. So I want you, what do you think about Jody's proposition, which has also been put forward by Ron Paul in his book, In the Fed, that the Federal Reserve has really been the catalyst for inflating our currency and an enemy, so to speak, of sound money?
I think it's not quite that simple. The Fed's biggest weapon is creating inflation, no doubt about it. And just to take an aside, if we go back to Hamilton's time, he did believe that the Bank of the U.S., in fact, the Bank of the U.S. is set up so it has a quarter of its assets in gold. But because they believe in a fractional reserve system where you can basically lend out more money than you have, secured by that, there were $10 million that were going to be secured by that $500,000 in gold and silver that were deposited in the bank. And so Hamilton was creating inflation, getting more money into circulation in order to make the economy grow. Those two things, for whatever reason, go hand in hand. So if you think that zero inflation is a good idea, I must assume that you would think that zero growth is also a good idea. And by the way, I would throw the question back at you a little bit. Why does the number matter? Why does that, 200% inflation or 20 times inflation, whatever number you cited, why does that matter? Why is that important?
Well, and I take your point there, Keith, because when it comes down to it, if the economy during that period has grown at least 20 times, then it's not a problem. Because really, and I'm sure a lot of members in our audience, there's Ritwick out there who seems to know a lot about economics. That's great for somebody in high school. But when you think about inflation, as long as it's keeping pace with economic growth, I know that there's not necessarily anything wrong with it, but I just wonder, in the sense that over 100 years, that it's not just that there's more currency or something like that, but the currency is worth so much less. Like I don't know if you watch The Americans, maybe some people are watching that, but that show's set in the 1980s. And I remember this from when I was a little kid, when the bag of chips used to cost like 45 cents or something like that, and now the same bag of chips costs $1. Now, maybe I'm that old, but I've seen our currency, I've seen the value cut in half. And I just wonder, are we twice as prosperous as we were? I certainly don't feel like our country's that much more. I don't know, but you see what I'm saying? When I look back less than 30 years, and I think like, whoa, I mean, the dollar is worth about half of what it was in the 1980s. I'm a little bit concerned.
It's only worth it nominally. It's only worth half nominally. You have to take into account purchasing power. And when I look around, I see a lot of prosperity. I'm a little bit older than you are. And so I can remember when gasoline was 59 cents a gallon. And the only thing is, I couldn't afford to buy 5 gallons. I didn't have any money. So, was my purchasing power any better? Well, no. I can afford it now. So I think you still have to look at price relative to purchasing power, and there's a balancing act there. I mean, is anybody today going to argue that the United States is less prosperous than it was in 1970? I mean, I don't think that's a winnable argument. In fact, it's on its face a loser, right? There's less poverty. There's much more in the way of physical comfort, and probably your average person is much better off. Do you always feel that way? Yeah, maybe not. And this past recession has pinched a lot of people. But I would argue that the Fed has done a pretty good job, which leads me back to a point that I was going to make earlier. Had the Fed not acted aggressively, and by the way, they're still acting pretty aggressively, just writing checks, buying government paper back to do what's called quantitative easing. They're pumping a lot of money into the economy, and if they had not done that, along with a huge fiscal stimulus from the Congress, then I think we're looking at a collapse that would have made the Great Depression just look like child's play. 25% unemployment would have been nothing compared to what was going to happen if the government did not step in and act as the lender of last resort, and the agency that could keep deflation, the deflationary spiral from taking place. If anything's worse than inflation, it's got to be deflation.
Well, now, of course, people said that, and that, yeah, that's actually a good point, I think, that you make there, which might be kind of outside of the scope of what some of these people are talking about. But yeah, deflation would not be desirable. Now the thing is, though, Keith, I hear that from a lot of people, and I remember before the bailout in 2008, you had Ben Bernanke from the Fed saying that if Congress doesn't bail out these banks, we're going to see it's going to make the Great Depression look like child's play, and we need government. All right, we need government to bail these banks out, who made a lot of mistakes. I mean, the thing is, the banks are engaging in these shady lending policies, and then they want Congress to bail them out. What we seem to have done here is by having this alliance between government and banks, we see that banks don't have any they don't have any risk, because it's like, if I make a good decision, I keep the money. If I make a bad decision, the government bails me out. Now, meanwhile, the individual doesn't get bailed out. I mean, is the Federal Reserve part of this? I mean, you think about, like, there's just this symbiotic relationship between the government and banks, and there's the Federal Reserve standing in the middle of it. You've got to give money to these banks or they're all going to fail, and the economies, and all that kind of stuff. But isn't this the very thing that Jefferson was afraid of, this alliance between government and the financial sector?
I don't know if Jefferson would have had any conception about the way modern finances work. I really don't. But let's come back to Jefferson in just a second. You said a whole mouthful there.
Oh, I always do.
I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that a lot of the financial crisis actually stems from some decisions that were made back during the Clinton administration to get rid of parts of the Glass-Steagall Act and to reduce regulation of not only securities but also banking. And so had there been more stringent oversight of these banks, maybe they wouldn't have been engaged in such shady deals. Maybe in this case, the solution would be a little more regulation of those folks instead of a hands-off approach, allowing these banks to get so big, the too big to fail concept. Now, is there a partnership between these people? I don't think so. I think the banks just had so much influence in the 90s and the early 2000s that they were able to get legislation that was very, very favorable to them passed and repeal some of the New Deal regulation that had kept banks in check, had them not be too big to fail and to be regulated and to be sound.
Okay, now let's see. I was checking the Twitter comments and all that, but I hear this a lot, Keith. Now, so what I'm hearing is that if only we'd had a little more government regulation, then this wouldn't have happened. That this is somehow that we let the economy just get a little bit too free. Of course, there are plenty of other explanations. You look at like Fannie and Freddie, who are making some of these lending regulations. But then what I hear from people is like, oh yeah, Glass-Steagall, we got rid of that. Which the thing is, that was a bipartisan decision to let Glass-Steagall expire. So, I mean,
it was a lousy bipartisan decision.
Well, I mean, but the thing is, now in your light, but then again, I wonder, is that really it? I mean, there were some other things done during the Clinton administration, for some of these loans that were made became legal and that sort of thing. But that's interesting, and that's really, I think, kind of indicative of the progressive viewpoint, and what really you and I could talk for hours about and keep going around in circles, because I think that one of the reasons I wanted to have this discussion, one of the reasons I think that students would really benefit from it, is that you still have this Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian tension in America today, that there are people who believe in the government's ability to act and do things that are good, as you've said, that there wasn't enough regulation. And then there are people like me of a more Jeffersonian bent that may look at everything government does with a bit of suspicion, sometimes possibly even to an unhealthy degree.
Let me, since we're bringing the conversation a little bit more towards Jefferson, let me throw this idea out at you. Jefferson is often lauded as a total free market guy, laissez-faire all the way, right? Would that be accurate?
I would say, yeah, for the most part. Now, of course, you go into today that Wall Street is a big factor in this, and so Jefferson. I mean, there's certainly, I mean, laissez-faire free market, but with a suspicion of banking institutions, or at least banking
Sure,
institutions
sure,
where you have centralized capital.
granted. But I would argue that Jefferson was anything but a laissez-faire guy, and here's why. Whereas he rightly suspected that Hamilton wanted to produce a certain kind of economic outcome, he wanted to encourage manufacturing. Hamilton made no secret of it, by the way. Jefferson argued for open markets, and yet, what did Jefferson do when he had the chance? He got legislation written to subsidize the creation of farms in the Northwest Territory by offering cheap land. So it's really whose ox is being gored here. Are you going to use the power of government to favor farmers, or are you going to use the power of government to favor manufacturers? I think that's the real issue. It's not that Jefferson would say, let's just let the market work it out. He didn't do that at all. In fact, he was pretty fond about using the force of law in order to enforce things like the embargo. So he wasn't a guy who said, hey, just let the market work at all costs. He also was one of these guys that said, let's get government to do things that we think are going to be good in the long run.
Well, now, one thing I would take issue with. Now, first of all, when I think about Jefferson's promotion of agriculture, I mean, agriculture had almost a religious element for him.
Oh,
Those who labor the earth are the chosen people of God. So for Jefferson, and that's, I want to go ahead and I love that we're going to Jefferson because that's like my favorite. All right, but the thing is that when you look at Jefferson's promotion of agriculture, he believed that if we become an urban society, that we are not going to be able to maintain Republican government. So in the sense that, hey, we've got this land, we might as well give it away to anybody who wants it. I don't know if that's necessarily playing favorites. Now, did Jefferson have a stake in expanding agriculture? Sure, but he believed that that was what was going to create a free and virtuous people, because farmers are not a dependent class. I mean, you don't see dependent farmers, at least in his day. You give somebody the means to be self-sufficient, and we create this agrarian republic. So I think that his commitment to agrarianism kind of transcends his market mentality. Now, of course, at the same time, he saw, the United States trading, that we farm here, we ship there, we get their materials, we don't need their dirty factories and stuff. So certainly Jefferson believed in promoting agriculture. I've got to give you that, even though I'm saying that I think there's a religious and ideological element there that kind of transcends economics. Now, on the other hand, I always take issue when people use the embargo to tarnish Jefferson's free market credentials, because what I see here is that Jefferson was using the embargo really as a measure to avoid war, and it wasn't a measure of this was economic warfare in lieu of going to war with Britain militarily. Now, it didn't work, but I don't think that it made Jefferson necessarily any less free market, because this was something that was just a pragmatic consideration because he knew we weren't ready for war with Britain. What would you say to that?
You make some good points, and yet I think my overall point stands that he was not afraid to interfere in the market where he thought it was useful, in this case for foreign policy purposes. And I'll take it a step further. One of the things that he really wanted to do was to tear down the whole Hamiltonian system. But when he comes into office, he does not, in fact, push for an early end to the charter of the Bank of the U.S. He does not push for an end to the tariff. Again, both pragmatic considerations granted. But would not those things have furthered, if he wanted a pure free market, would those things have furthered that goal? I think so. And back to your point about farmers, yeah, the ideology of landholding in early America is not just Jefferson. I mean, that goes back to the Puritans. That's an English thing through and through, that you can't really be a man. And this cuts to the quick about that issue. You said that Jefferson believed that an urban class could not really be true Republicans. And because they didn't own anything, they had no stake, right? So Jefferson is, in fact, using the power of government and subsidizing the creation of farms. I mean, land isn't free, but in this case, it was pretty close to it. Plus, you're using the United States Army, paid for by all taxpayers, to remove the inhabitants of the land in order to, through warfare, in order to settle that land. And what does Jefferson get out of it? Huge political benefits. by two pieces of legislation, the Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance, he almost guarantees that at least for a short while, you're going to have a majority in Congress that is that agrarian yeoman farmer class, which oddly enough, he is not one of, which always blows my mind. He's an aristocratic farmer, yeah? He is not the guy out there clearing the land, the independent farmer. He is deeply involved in the market, which sort of is kind of mind-blowing to me. And he becomes the leader of this group of people that believes deeply in individualism, believes in you say as being self-sufficient. And Jackson essentially is the same way. Jackson is in some ways a very near copy of Jefferson in that sense. He's an aristocratic plantation owner, slave owner, who's involved in the market. He's able to make money because he's able to sell either tobacco in the case of Jefferson or cotton in the case of Jackson on the market. So they're dependent on this developing market economy. So in that way, they're both sort of enigmas. They're hard to get your head around.
All right, just one second. Let me see what's going on here. Morwick wants to try to get in here. Which, if anybody wants to email me, I would love to take. I've had people ask me questions via Twitter, but if somebody wants to email me, tr@tomrichey.net, and you want an invite, you want to come in and ask a live question, because I think that Keith and I are about at the point where we could do some live Q&A. So I certainly would like to entertain that. If there's anybody who wants to jump in, ask a few questions, join us, dialogue with us a little bit, as long as you don't have like some really sketchy light setup or something like that. Make sure you're in a well-lit room or something like that. But yes, send me a quick email and I can send you an invite. I would love to see some people actually come in and ask a couple of questions. Now, Keith, I think that you do make a point here that I really can't contest, in the sense that, yeah, I mean, when it comes down to it, we are all willing to use the power of government when we believe it to be beneficial. Now, I do believe that Jefferson was sincere in his mistrust of government, but everybody uses it sometimes. I mean, when I'm teaching students, I think about like the One Ring, that this is one of those things that government, if you look at government like Jefferson, that government is something that, hey, every once in a while you might have to put it on your finger, but every time you do it, you might think, oh yeah, it's just making me invisible. No, it's corrupting your soul. That you have to use it sparingly. That if you use it too much, you're going to be like Gollum, my precious, that sort of thing. And that's really, I mean, I think that's the Jeffersonian view of government, that just because he's using the ring now and then, it's kind of like that whole, like, Boromir thing, or maybe Boromir's Hamilton, I don't know. But I'm probably, ever since I watched the interview, I've gotten even more out of control with my Lord of the Rings analogy. So if people can kind of excuse me. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely something to be said for Jefferson being willing to use the power of government here and there, whether it's the free market, whether it's the free land, which of course that's something kind of taken up by Lincoln's party with which free soil literally means free soil, that they were wanted to settle white farmers out in the West and have these freeholding people out there who would be independent. So that's now let me kind of look at some of my questions real quick and kind of make sure that we hit everything, because I think we've accomplished a lot of what what I kind of wanted to see here. That we've talked about the Federal Reserve, we've talked about really just this kind of Jeffersonian Hamiltonian thing, which I think just reverberates throughout all of U.S. history. I'm going to look at the chat room and all of that kind of stuff. Let's see if I've got any questions on Twitter. I still don't have an email from our friend that wanted to get in here, but I will keep looking and see if I have an email there. Let's see, Keith, do you have anything you want to initiate or anything like that? Anything on your mind?
Yeah, I'd like to go back. I was sitting here thinking that very thing. I'd like to go back and revisit one thing that I don't think I really answered. You talked a little bit about the gold standard, and we don't want to go off into la-la land with the gold standard. I understand that. But the alternative, one of the alternatives to having a central bank that functions like the Fed, would be obviously to go to a gold standard. Well, we have experience with that too. The times that we've been on gold standard have been deflationary times. It's been tough for common people to make a living, and I would say this, and I'll just leave the gold standard discussion aside after I say this, unless you want to add something, of course. If you believe in a gold standard that's going to allow for zero inflation, or some sort of gold standard that floats with the market, either one, I think that's a pessimistic view of human nature in the future. The whole idea that you have a growing currency, in other words, an inflationary, inflated currency, is based on the optimistic idea that the economy will grow, that people will work and do better. If you want a gold standard, everything you read about people who advocate a gold standard, one of the big things they talk about is ending the business cycle. I don't know how realistic that is. I'm not that well versed in economics to tell you if that would even work. Don't know. But if there's no business cycle, that means there's no upside. Yeah, there's no downside, but there's no upside. Things just continue in an almost medieval fashion, where if you have money, if you are like Ron Swanson and you don't know how much money you have, but you know how many pounds of money you have because it's in gold, then you're going back to a medieval concept of what money really is. And of course, this could take us off into another discussion about commodity money versus fiat money, but I think that's probably for another day.
Yeah, now you mentioned Ron Swanson. I wouldn't think that Ron Swanson would be a big fan of the Federal Reserve, do you?
Oh, no doubt. I don't think he likes banks. But the weird thing is, Ron Swanson is like Jefferson in the sense that he works for government. He works for the county Parks and Rec.
Yeah, and it's really a lot like me, because a lot of times I've got a bit of a classical liberal libertarian bent, that sort of thing. But yes, I still do work, and yeah, I work for the government, and that's one of those things. So Ron Swanson sometimes kind of dear to my heart. Now, one of my students wanted me to point these out, because what I do, and I want to just kind of point that out. Another reason why I initiated this discussion, I find that oppositional perspectives are just a great way to learn about something. So I have my students read a few pages from Ron Paul's book, In the Fed, and on the other hand, Keith, have you ever seen these comic books that the Federal Reserve puts out?
I haven't. You mentioned them, and the Fed mentions them as well.
Okay. Yeah, and so the New York Fed has put out some comic books, and let me see, I believe that I've got them somewhere on my computer. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just so some people can see. A couple of these are available online. And so I show the students, on one hand, Ron Paul is kind of anti-Federal Reserve propaganda, but the Federal Reserve creates its own propaganda. You can look at this comic book here, The Story of the Federal Reserve System, and you can look through all of this stuff. Now it looks like this is this particular copy here isn't working quite like we'd like it to. Let me try something here. Let me just zoom out just a little bit. Okay, there we go. All right, and does this move at all? I don't know. Okay, this is a particular one that I found online, but you can look and kind of see this whole thing from the perspective of the Federal Reserve and all of the great things that the Federal Reserve does for us. Now, I love this one here. That, let's see if I can, if I zoom in, the only problem is, let's see, I can't. Actually, there's not any kind of hand tool or anything like that. But this, just take my word for it, I guess. Now, y'all can look this up. Just look up Federal Reserve comic books or the story of the Federal Reserve System. This says here, in more serious cases, the Fed can fine banks and individuals. And in the most extreme cases, it can even close the bank. And there's the Fed looking almost like, I think that's how Ron Paul sees the Fed when he looks at it. But your bank has been operating in an unsafe manner. We can't let that continue. You'll either have to get more capital or shut down. All right, so really the Fed, and then there's another one. There's like the story of inflation or the story of monetary policy or something like that. Let me see if I can find this. The story of monetary policy. Let's see what's going to come up here. Okay, New York. Okay, there we go. And this is on the New York Fed. So you can pull up a PDF, the story of monetary policy. And there's one point that I think the Federal Reserve is actually depicted as a real superhero. All right, let's see if we can find this. But now that's one thing that I wonder, Keith, if there is an agency that has to propagandize to this extent. Okay, here we go. We've got the Federal Reserve hero here that inflation, central bank independence. Oh, okay. So this is also this little chart here arguing for the independence of the Fed, and then there's the Fed trying to get that inflation done, da da da, and that sort of thing. And of course, people blame the Fed, but guess what? It's not the Fed's fault, right? So all that kind of stuff. Which the thing is, you see that kind of stuff and you wonder, okay, now of course they say that, the Fed's going to say that we need to be independent, which it kind of spills over into some stuff I'm talking about in AP government, really that we talk about in AP US history. You think about the federal judiciary and the power of judicial review. Who gave the judiciary the power of judicial review? The judiciary did. All right. And the judiciary, they have the doctrine of selective incorporation, where it's not that they apply the Bill of Rights to the states carte blanche, but the Supreme Court can decide when to apply the Bill of Rights to the states and when it doesn't apply to the states. And it seems to me that this quote-unquote independence that they seem to champion, is that not just kind of a motive to get to do whatever they want? I mean, and I even hear from people sometimes, that, they expect some, I mean, lots of conspiratorial type of stuff. But what do you have to answer to this kind of propaganda effort that the Fed seems to make to keep itself, to make itself look good in the public eye?
Well, I doubt that any of my kids have ever read that. I doubt that any kids in my school have ever read that. So if it's a propaganda effort, it's not a very good one. Right? If they were, maybe if they were.
Now they're pretty good comic books, Keith. I don't. I mean, my daughter may read them. I don't want anybody to think that we're here saying that it's bad work.
Yeah, they're drawn. It looks like in kind of a 1930s, 40s kind of style. I mean, it looked pretty good. But on the other hand, I think you'd have a case if they were running commercials on national TV, trying to prop themselves up. I just don't see much there, to be honest.
Okay, I do think that's pretty fair. Now we're heading up toward 10 o'clock. Let me take a look. I don't really see anything on Twitter, but the thing's kind of active here. Let's see. I see Morwick. It's part of a worldwide banking cartel. Let's see if Morwick ever. Oh goodness, I'd love to get Morwick in here. Yeah, there's actually somebody that I'd love to see Morwick debate. What is my email? Morwick, tr@tomrichey.net. Okay, so tr@tomrichey.net. Let's see if I can get him. Oh, comments can't contain links. Please put the okay, so I can't do that. But you can also go to my website and just put contact me or something like that. But anyway, let's see. It looks like, yeah, I can't put my email onto the comments, but I would love to set up a cage match between Morwick and somebody who's one of my former students. That would be great. Now the other thing is, so yeah, there's one of my former students that would love to have this debate, who's finishing up a degree in economics. Now the thing is, let's see if I can find anything there. But this debate that's been happening here, I think this is really good stuff here. All right, well, we are heading toward 10 o'clock, so I feel like, Keith, I appreciate having you being on here. It's been great to just kind of go back and forth on this in a way that's relevant to students taking AP US history courses. Anything to say on your way out?
No, I've really enjoyed this. I think it was a good discussion. I think every point that was made was fair, and we had a good give and take. Wish we could extend it out to some just a general philosophy about government, because I think that's where it naturally goes. Obviously, I don't share the kind of deep skepticism that many people do about government. I think it's a tool like anything else. It can be positive, it can be negative. It just depends on the people that are in office.
All right, yeah. So that's a good point. And those of you that are watching, there are 17 of you that are still here. I'm really appreciative of the people that are here. And keep in mind that I've got a website, tomrichey.net. I've got my YouTube channel here, youtube.com/TomRichey. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. Just look for me there at Tom Richey on Twitter and Instagram. I do tutoring. I also do some of these live hangouts. So we're going to do some more as the exam comes closer. So just keep that in mind. Keep me in mind as you prepare for the exam, and I'll certainly be keeping you in mind and trying to offer as much as I can to you as you prepare. I'm looking into coming out with a video on multiple choice strategy for the APUSH exam pretty soon, so look out for that. And thanks again, Keith, for being on here this evening, and thank you all for watching, and we'll see you soon. Until next time.